The time has come. Yeah, it's November 2024. We are within 3-4 weeks of the new Haruki Murakami book coming out, The City and Its Uncertain Walls. I don't have a physical copy because it hasn't actually come out yet. I'll put the cover here. It's ugly. It doesn't look good. I was fortunate enough to get an advance copy from the publishers. It's probably the coolest thing that's ever happened to me because of this channel. I'm like yay far away from monetization, and that'll be great. 4 years of talking about books in exchange for reading the new Haruki Murakami book early. Pretty good. Thank you to the publishers for letting me have this book early, and it's finally time to talk about it in depth. I did make a video some months ago talking about my initial impressions of the book, and I finished it, I want to say more than a month ago at this point. But now that I've had time to kind of sit with it, let it marinate in my brain a little bit, I have some thoughts about it. So buckle up. If you haven't read the book yet, which likely you haven't, I'm going to keep it pretty spoiler free here. I'm not going to go into the specific details of the plot. There are not a ton of things in it to spoil. I think if you've read a Haruki Murakami book before, you kind of know what you're in for, in a way. You know, his books aren't necessarily hinging on some crazy plot twist most of the time, and that's not the case here. So, yeah, without any further ado, off the top, what I want to say is that it's been roughly 6 years since Killing Commendatore came out in English, and boy, that was a long 6 years. I'm 31 at the time of this video. That would have made me 25 when that book came out. And I've certainly aged. Here's a picture of me from when I was 25. You notice there's not as much gray hair. The reason I bring up aging and getting older is that not only have I gotten older and wiser, but Haruki Murakami has definitely gotten older. Wiser? Who's to say? Certainly in the years between 2018 and 2024, there's been a lot of online discourse about Haruki Murakami's work. I don't really want to get into all that today. This is not the point of this video, to litigate the sort of sexual politics of Haruki Murakami's work. But all I will say is that in those 6 years, Murakami has gotten older, and he's written a book with The City and Its Uncertain Walls that is definitely reflecting on the passing of time, reflecting on getting older, relationships changing, and I think that's really cool. You know, books always have the story within it, but then there is always sort of this meta-narrative sitting on top of it that you can analyze. Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes the author is actively trying to comment on whether it's stuff going on in the world or stuff going on in their personal life, but there's also that added layer of cultural meta-narrative. And so us as consumers of Haruki Murakami's work can sort of imbue his stories with more meaning than maybe he even intended it to because of our interpretations of it. Without getting too lost in that sauce, I should probably just talk about the general vibe of the book. I think that as far as Haruki Murakami books go, this one is relatively small scale, even given how fantastical the premise is. If you didn't know, part of this book takes place in the same world that Hardboiled Wonderland and The End of the World takes place in, meaning that there is a city with uncertain walls around it, and there are those unicorn beasts from that book. It is fantastical in that way. But with that said, I think the book has a lot more in common with some of Murakami's more grounded books, like Sputnik Sweetheart, Norwegian Wood, kind of like a sad romance thing going on at the core of the story. I also think this book has a little bit in common with Kafka on the Shore, if only because there is a library in both of those books, and there's a character in each one of those books that sort of goes to that library to sort of figure out what's going on with themselves. I gotta say that the stakes that this book is playing with, even though they are in some ways kind of high concept, but in other ways more understated, I was kind of shocked at that at first. My first thought was oh, it's going to be like a noir, it's going to be kind of wacky and like a detective story. And it's not that at all. Certainly there's like a mystery to the town, just like there was in Hard-Boiled Wonderland. But the book isn't some like pulpy thing. It's much slower and more meditative than that book is. And that's kind of why I'm comparing it to Norwegian Wood or Sputnik Sweetheart. It kind of goes at a little bit of a snail's pace at first. There is kind of a clear division in the book. Once you get about like halfway through, it does jump to definitely a different phase of the book, and it kind of goes in a different direction for a while. But overall, I think this book is really sort of internal, even with all of the kind of standard surreal Murakami-isms that are going on outside of it. So all that is to say, if you're going into this book expecting like 1Q84 or something like that, that's not what this is. If you're looking to kind of get lost in your feelings, maybe you've gone through a breakup recently, this is probably more your speed. It might be psychologically damaging for you, depending on what situation you're in, but just know that going into the book. All right, getting into how I actually feel about the book, these are some of the things that I liked. It had been a while since I had read a Murakami book, or at least like a good Murakami book. I did reread Sputnik Sweetheart recently, and it's still his worst book. It's not bad, except for it's not great. But I hadn't read one of his books in a while that truly made me kind of feel that thing that Haruki Murakami books make you feel. That sort of like indescribable meditative pull that it puts you in. I know when I read Haruki Murakami, it's kind of like everything else is like not existing for a while. With Sputnik Sweetheart, whatever, I'm going to get distracted. But Kafka on the Shore, Wind Up Bird Chronicle, 1Q84, you're truly sort of transported into that realm. And it kind of feels like you're inside of your own head. With that said, reading this book definitely felt more like that. It didn't feel like one of his more disposable books, if that makes sense. So it was kind of nice just to like sink back into that zone that his books put me in, which felt great, felt very nostalgic, especially considering I got into his books when I was quite younger than I am right now. Another thing that I liked a lot is I think Murakami is at his best when he is sort of setting up a concept for the book to live in. And in that concept, he can explore all the things he wants to explore. Some examples of that are 1Q84, where there's the two moons in the sky, and there's sort of this impression that they've slipped into an alternate version of reality. In Hard-Boiled Wonderland and The End of the World, you have this sort of dual narrative thing going on, where you have the guy in the real world and then the guy in the world inside of his head. And obviously this book sort of touches on that again, and I think that's part of why the book works. Norwegian Wood, Sputnik Sweetheart, South of the Border, West of the Sun, those are all fine books, but because they don't really have much of a concept behind them, they haven't stayed with me as much as his other books have. That's just a personal preference thing, but I really like it when Murakami is kind of thinking outside of the box, going high concept, that kind of thing. And another thing I liked, going back to what I talked about earlier, is this really does feel like Murakami commenting on the state he's in his life right now. I'm not saying that the character in the book is a stand-in for him, but he's getting older, the world is changing around him, and I think through reading it, you can kind of get the impression that he's meditating a lot on the passage of time and sort of what you become after a lifetime of all the things that have happened to you. And I think that's really cool. And I also think, which I'll touch on later, it seems like that's something that might age well as the years go on. Like when you revisit this book 20 years from now, with that context in mind, I think it might pop out for you even more than it does upon an initial read in 2024. So, some things I didn't like about the book, or was just kind of like mixed on in general, because I don't think there's anything in this book that I hated, but there's certainly some things that I liked more than others, and these are kind of the areas where I was like, whatever, First off, and this is the case with any Murakami book in the past decade, 15 years, really really everything like 2000s and beyond, is that he is kind of playing in the same sandbox that he always has. He's got all the toys he likes, and again, that's fine. I'm not going to knock him for it, but if there's a 6-year wait between novels and what he's doing is giving us a world that he's already explored, using all the tropes he usually uses, there's a little bit of disappointment there, at least for me. 1284, to me, felt like this brand new adventure. Like, it didn't feel like there was something in his bibliography that really occupied that same zone. And so even though this book is its own thing, it's not a retelling of Hard-Boiled Wonderland, it is still kind of him treading over territory that he has done before, at least in concept and at least in the tropes within the book, right? There's cooking, cats, jazz, underage girls, like he's doing all the same shit he always does. And again, if you like Murakami, that might not bother you. It didn't really bother me, but it was sort of like a reminder of like, yeah, I don't think he's ever going away from that. Should we expect him to? No. Again, I knew what I was getting into going into this book. It doesn't mean it's not like, again, but still, it's acceptable. It's okay. In terms of like the more problematic aspects of Murakami, again, I'm not going to get into all of it. I think that requires a lot more thought and patience and time, frankly, to take in all of the different perspectives on that. But with that said, I think there are things in Murakami's work that kind of jump out at you. Like, they're not really things that you have to think that hard about for them to be weird. And I think number one on that list is just his like descriptions of sex and his character's relationship with women, or just kind of how he writes women in general. This book is no exception. Like, within the first 100 pages or so, there's like an observation about a woman's breasts, and it's like, knock it off. just stop, man. Like, we get it. We don't need it again. It's the same description every time, pretty much. And then later on in the book, there's another woman who, her character and sort of the things that are interesting about her are sort of also couched in some sexual weirdness. I'm not saying this because of any sort of like prudish tendencies on my part. It's more just like they feel kind of underbaked. It feels to me like if you're going to have these things in your novel, you shouldn't be doing the same thing over and over again, and you should be approaching the subject matter with something that isn't such like a blunt instrument, I guess. I think that's all I have to say about that part of it. But again, that is sort of on my list of like things about the book that were a little icky or that I didn't like. In summation, I just think that all the stuff I don't like about this book is stuff that's just sort of him painting by numbers Murakami style. That's not the worst thing in the world. I think there's going to be some people who read this book who really don't like it because of that. It didn't really bother me. I've said this a million times, but like every time Martin Scorsese does a gangster movie, yes, he's playing with all the same sort of like themes and aesthetics, but they're usually pretty good. Same is the case with Murakami. Final verdict on this book, I liked it. I thought it was pretty good. And I know that might be kind of an underwhelming assessment if you've waited 6 years for a new Murakami book to come out. But that's sort of what I expected this entire time. Like, I didn't go... Like, once the sort of, like, media cycle for this book started, where it was announced, oh, when is it being published? When is it being published in English? What's the cover going to look like? Again, not good. I knew the whole time that it wasn't going to be some, like, mind-blowing book. I'm not under the delusion that he's going to create something in a way that, like, broke my brain open the first time I read one of his books. So, with that in mind, even though it's, like, pretty good, that's great. You know, like, I think the worst thing would be to have even those middling expectations not be met. Like, if this was truly a stinker or just felt really inconsequential, that would suck. Like, if he came out with, like, a 200-page book... Actually, you know what? Maybe a 200-page book would be good. Anyway, if he came out with something that was, like, hyped up to all hell, and it ended up being just this fucking boring thing, that would suck, for sure. But for him to be doing all the same things, again, but with that kind of metatextual setting that it's in, that's cool, especially at this stage in his career. I should also say, too, that, you know, I read my first Haruki Murakami book when I was in my senior year of college, and he was kind of what helped me get back into reading, and I rushed through all of his novels in like a couple of years. I think most of them I read in 1 year, actually. And in that time, in those 6 years between him putting out Killing Commendatore and this, my tastes have changed a lot. I've read a million other things that I like just as much as I like him, and sometimes more. I'm really grateful that he's still around. I'm really thankful that reading one of his books in the first place kind of kickstarted this entire hobby and this YouTube channel and everything that's come from it. But with that said, like, I don't know, there's so many other books sitting on my shelf that I'm more excited for than I was for this book. I'm still reading Shogun. I'm halfway through Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. I'm also halfway through the third book in the Dandelion Dynasty, which is like incredible shit. It's so good. And it's not like Murakami at all, and I still love it. I've done the work, you know what I mean? Like, I've gone and read other Japanese authors that have, like, influenced Murakami or have been influenced by Murakami, and I do really enjoy that stuff still. Or even his contemporaries, like people that he didn't necessarily inspire, but that were operating at the same time as him, like when he was in his prime, you might say. And that's all great. But I also really enjoy, like, a good fantasy series. Science fiction is probably the thing that occupies my brain the most at this point. I don't know if you can see it back here, but, you know, I'd recommend Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang to anyone. And I wouldn't necessarily do that with Haruki Murakami. There's been a lot of books in those 6 years that have kind of like fundamentally changed me as a person. Going back to this is kind of how I felt when John Frusciante came back to Red Hot Chili Peppers recently, and they put out a couple albums of new songs, and it's like, cool, glad to have them. Are they good? Yeah, pretty good. Am I going to choose these new songs to listen to over like the old favorites? Probably not. It is possible. Sometimes people release like late career masterpieces, and I do think this book could become sort of an underrated gem over time. There's a kid who works at the bookstore that I live by, and I remember talking to him a while ago about Murakami, and I asked him which one was his favorite / first one, and it was Killing Commendatore. And I'm pretty sure that's the case for Haruki Murakami Art, which is another YouTube channel that focuses on Haruki Murakami. And that's so wild to me, because my first was Wind Up Bird Chronicle. And so when I think of Killing Commendatore, I think of it just as like a sort of Wind Up Bird Chronicle again. And it's hard for me not to compare it to that. Whereas people who have come to Murakami for the first time with that book, it did the same thing to them as it did to me. And that's great. Art is subjective. Live your truth, whatever you like. I'm not going to yuck your yum. And I do recommend this book, especially to people who like Murakami already. And in thinking about other people's reactions to Killing Commendatore and having read that for the first time, this might be a good starting point for Murakami too. One last thing before I go. Every year, except for that 1 year, they give out a Nobel Prize in Literature to an author who has been one of the greats, created cultural change, an author who has sort of like become imprinted in the language in which we talk about books. And it happened again this year. They gave the Nobel Prize to Hong Kong, who's another one of my favorite authors. If you haven't read any of her books, please do so. The Vegetarian is incredible. I think Human Acts is probably her best one. She doesn't have a bad book. The reason I bring this up is because inevitably, every single year that Haruki Murakami doesn't win the Nobel Prize, there is this thing within his fandom where people like are upset about it. Why? What are you doing with your life? He doesn't know you. He's rich and critically acclaimed up and down. Why does he need a Nobel Prize? It's beyond ridiculous. I don't think that anyone needs something they like and their feelings about the thing they like to be affirmed by like a group of people who are putting in a ballot to say which one of those things they like the best. Just like what you like. If Haruki Murakami wins the Nobel Prize, his books don't get any better. They are as good as they are right now as they would be if he had a Nobel Prize. So let's just put it to bed. My favorite album of all time, I think, because it changes, is To Pimp a Butterfly by Kendrick Lamar. If you're unfamiliar with him, incredibly critically lauded as an artist. And To Pimp a Butterfly, in my opinion, is his magnum opus. It didn't win the Grammy for Best Album of the Year. It should have, if we were going off of my personal taste, right? But it didn't win. I still think it's the best album I've ever heard. And also, just like Murakami, as Kendrick Lamar puts out new music, puts out new albums, expresses himself into the later years of his life, I'm not going to get mad or that disappointed if he doesn't make something that's as good as To Pimp a Butterfly. It still exists. You can still enjoy it. While Murakami is still here, let's enjoy him. Whether you're going to read the new book or not, his old classics still exist. There's joy to be found there. There's joy to be found in this book. So with that said, I mean like a 4 out of 10, probably. It's more like a 3.5, but half stars are for cowards. If Goodreads isn't giving you the option, then don't even worry about it. Thank you for watching. Truly, thank you for watching, especially if you've been watching my videos for an extended period of time. I think my favorite part about having this YouTube channel is the sort of Murakami community that I've found. None of the people in my life read his books. I've introduced people to him, and usually the reception is like lukewarm at best. But when I post these videos and you comment on them, and I get to like talk to other people all around the world about this thing that we mutually like, what an incredible thing that is. And I'm so glad to have you. So thanks again for watching. I gotta go finish these other books that I've been reading for months. Yeah, that's about it. Enjoy your day, and bye.